We're going to start. The proceedings tonight is being streamed live, so we're on a fairly tight sort of schedule for timing. Welcome to everybody. Thank you so much for being here tonight on a rather chilly Johannesburg evening. It is my very great pleasure to welcome you and our panelists for this evening to UJ, to the UJ Library, and on behalf of the Visual Identities in Art and Design Research Centre, of which I am the director. I'd like to briefly just introduce you to our panelists and our chair. Although the chair, Christy van der Westhuizen, will be giving you more information about each panelist at the start. Firstly, I'd like to introduce you to Prof. Shona Hunter, who's sitting right over here. She's an associate professor in sociology and social policy governance at the University of Leeds and has just been appointed as a visiting associate professor at the Visual Identities in Art and Design Research Centre here at UJ. And we're very excited about her appointment as a visiting associate professor, coming as it does on a history of work that Shona has been doing with the Research Centre over the past 5 years. And I would say that this book that we are here to discuss tonight has been very, very important and influential in certain directions and conceptual thinking that the Centre has and is taking at the moment. So thank you for that, Shona. It's really a huge privilege to have you here. Our chair for this evening is Prof. Christy van der Westhuizen, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology, University of Pretoria. Christy is at the end there. And we have a very distinguished panel of speakers tonight. Next to Christy is Prof. Desiree Lewis from the Department of Women and Gender Studies at the University of the Western Cape. Dr. Heidi Groenebaum, Senior Researcher at the Centre for Humanities Research, University of the Western Cape. Prof. Grace Kunu, Associate Professor in the Sociology Department at the University of Johannesburg and Vice Dean of Research in the Faculty of Humanities here at UJ. Okay, I'm not going to spend further time, but would like to again, thank you all for being here, and thank particularly our colleagues at the UJ Library for their incredible assistance and support in hosting and setting up this event. Particularly, I'd like to thank Dr. Rukaya Bauer, who's the Executive Director of the UJ Library, Reneka Pandey, Theo Modisa, Yvonne Bukwa, Dorcas Rathaba, and from the VIAD staff, particular thanks go to Claire Jorgensen and Maria Fidel Regueros, who have been working incredibly hard over the last few months to put this all together. Thank you. Okay, just to say, it's very unfortunate that we don't have copies of the actual book to sell tonight. It would have been really nice to have them available, or at least to have paperback versions available. But we do have online forms where you can get all the details about ordering the book. You know, obviously the exchange rate has not been favorable enough for us to bring out, you know, enough copies for sale purposes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Leora. Thanks for that introduction. My name is Christy van der Westhuizen. I'm from the University of Pretoria, and I'm going to adopt a rather horizontal approach to this evening's proceedings by just remaining right where I am. And I think most of my speakers also prefer just to keep this a conversation and you know, at an engaging and inviting kind of level. So before I introduce Shona, I've had the pleasure of actually reading most of the book, and I must say that in short, Shona brings in the the state in the face of quite a considerable neoliberal onslaught, as we know, since the advent of Thatcherism. So and in a very unexpected way, she's bringing in the state through the concept of relational politics, which she understands as the state as an enactment through emotional investment and the constant negotiation of subjective loss. So the state, in that sense, is then something that's constantly and consistently produced. And in a sense, it's being done, and it can be done differently. So it opens up quite fantastic possibilities around agency and around change and transformation, which is particularly relevant in our context. So for me, Shona provides a way out of the cul-de-sac that we frequently find ourselves in here in South Africa when we try to think the state, and particularly because our analysis is so narrowly focused, on institutions or ideologies, and when subjectivities do come up, it's usually with a very narrow focus on big men and what they could possibly be thinking, and what could be the possible motivations for their actions, which is not very productive. So this idea of relational politics and enactment of the state then happens through the everyday practices of policy making and governance, and there Shona brings in empirical work, actually, that I also, from my own background, which is in critical diversity studies, found very interesting, around how to break through that sort of neoliberal kind of feel good, one could say almost like a defanging, pulling the teeth of diversity, and she's got a fascinating chapter on that. So it helps us. I think this approach definitely helps us to break through this straitjacket of approaching politics as a rational moral calculus, which is usually in our analysis what happens when it's clearly so much more complex. There's a complexity that's frequently unaccounted for in our analysis, and in the process also she delivers a very powerful comment on neoliberalism and how it fits with whiteness. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce Shona to you. As Leora's mentioned, she's an associate professor in sociology and social policy governance at the University of Leeds. And she's also a visiting associate professor here at VIAD at UJ. Her work is interdisciplinary. Her background is in critical policy studies. She has research interests in all aspects of welfare governance, state practices, and the broader material, cultural, effective politics through which the state is enacted nationally and globally. So this book draws together her ongoing work, and you can see, in terms of the citations also in the book, this has been work that's been building over a period of 10, 15 years that she's drawing together, and this book is in a sense a culmination. And I'm sure we'll hear about what's the way forward also from here. She is the academic lead for the White Spaces Research Collaboration, which brings together colleagues from 23 countries. And she's got various publications, including a special issue of the journal Social Politics, and so forth. She has. Let me just see if there's anything else that I want to mention. She has publications in critical race and whiteness studies, critical arts, South-North media, cultural studies, equal opportunities international, the Journal of Psychosocial Studies, and so forth. So without further ado, then I'm going to hand over to Shona to address us for the next 15 minutes.
Hey, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. I tend to be quite loud anyway, so I suspect you might be deafened. Let me know if anybody's kind of losing the power to hear, because I'm kind of making it too loud. Okay, so I'm going to try and just give you a sense of, I suppose, my ways into the work, the book, how I came to be writing it, how it kind of developed, and along the way give you a sense of some of the key ideas. But that's really all I can do with the next 15 minutes, and I'm sure the others have probably got much more fascinating things to say, or at least will hopefully have interesting engagements in relation to their own work. So yeah, I'm kind of interested that I brought the English weather with me also. I've been thinking about saying that all day. So I don't know whether that makes you happy or whether that makes you sad. I'm not sure how it makes me feel. Okay, so right, I wanted to start off just talking a little bit about why I wrote the book. And I suppose the book came out of a frustration, a kind of academic frustration, but also a set of kind of personal stuff that I was working through. So kind of academically, my background is in sociology, social policy, actually cultural studies inflected kind of sociology. And I was quite frustrated really with the ways in which, and the languages and the ways we were allowed to think in academic contexts through power. So I was really interested in understanding more about how power worked, but I was interested in trying to prize apart an either-or analysis of power. So for me, one of the things that a lot of academic work, even social constructionist academic work, even some of the most kind of trendy theorists that we think about, the ways in which they get taken up, is often tends to position people in terms of either power or inequality. And so for me, that never really felt like an analysis that enabled me to understand the sorts of institutional practices that I was engaged in, the people around me that were engaged in, so that I was engaged in as an academic, that the people around me had been engaged in as policymakers, as my father was a policeman, so as kind of everyday bureaucrats, my mum was a social worker, the sorts of things that I witnessed in relation to the various kind of friends, colleagues, and myself, my own kind of struggles in relation to institutions, seemed to me to be much more complicated than we were allowed to understand through categories of power. So I'm interested in thinking about aspects of social power, so gender, ethnicity, age, all of those things. I'm interested in thinking through ideas of positioning, how that places us in relation to power, but those sorts of languages and the way they allowed us to think about power didn't seem to be complicated enough for me. So that was kind of my starting point really in relation to the book. And when I'm talking about somebody who is situated within an English context, in the context of the global north at the moment. When we think about power in that sort of institutional space, we're often thinking through ideas of white masculinities, white middle-class masculinities, white, forgive me, middle-aged white class masculinities. So the sorts of categories that that we were talking through in academic work didn't seem to fit with everyday experiences, but I had a very strong understanding of the structures of power or systems of power within which we're all situated. So really what the book's about is trying to think about how do we break out of understanding our relationships to power or to agency as only about social categories. So only about, for me, being a white kind of younger end of middle-aged, lower-aged kind of woman. You know, what does that mean for how I behave in institutional spaces, how I interact with the various people that I meet kind of day to day? So the book, in a way, as well as having this academic beef, also had a very kind of strongly personal aspect for me, which was about the ways in which I was actually struggling through my own institutional politics. So it started off, I think, as what I would call a small book. And I don't mean that anybody who knows anything about me knows I talk and write reams. So I don't necessarily mean in terms of words, but there was an interest in something that didn't make sense in terms of my everyday, that I really wanted to prize apart what that meant in relation to these kind of grand narratives. So, or what we think of often in terms of grand narratives as academics. I think one of the other things that was important about thinking through my own experiences and thinking through the experiences of family, friends, colleagues, the people that I saw around me, and the narratives we hear from politicians, from kind of various institutional actors, was also the pain of institutional life for people in positions of power. And when I'm thinking about that, I'm not wanting to position people who are positioned through power institutionally, hierarchically as victims, but I'm wanting to understand the ways in which those people are struggling in really quite complicated ways with doing good work, what they at least think, what I would like to think is good work. So I was interested really in trying to prise apart kind of, I suppose, a deeper set of philosophical issues were about trying to prise apart what it means to be good in an institutional context, which is framed through the sorts of what many of us might consider really highly problematic narratives around kind of finance, capital, what matters in institutional spaces. So I didn't, so it's like, how do we do good work in a context which is potentially set up to frame our institutional actions via the imposition of power on others, whether that be the people we're working with, the people we're engaging with externally, users, clients. You know, I mean, you could go back to my dad as an example again. He gets kind of roped in all sorts of contexts. But as a policeman, you know, how do you go about arresting somebody who might live next door to you? What does that feel like? What does that mean? What does it mean to police people literally, and also metaphorically, well, literally in an institutional context, whether you're a policeman or not, okay? So it's about how do we do our own power in institutional context in ways that make us responsible, and or that we can at least understand ourselves as being responsible. And how do we understand that? Sorry, I don't know, is the mic working? Yeah? And how do we understand that as related to these larger structures of power that we're often talking about? So these big categories, gender, ethnicity, and neoliberalism. How does all this stuff knit together? So a final aspect of that, I suppose, the general issue that I'm looking at in the English context again, and this might be something we talk about more, but really is, I suppose, a loss of the sense of the self as being good that occurs when we enter into institutional spaces and have to make decisions that we wouldn't necessarily want to make, or have to impose actions that we wouldn't necessarily want to make. What struggles are going on there? And then in that context, the recognition of the constitutive nature of the social differences that are making those struggles difficult. So these larger categories, when we're positioned through a formal category, what is it for me as a white woman to impose a decision on a black woman colleague which disempowers her in a particular sort of way? And how do I understand that, whether even if it might be through the narratives of an institutional procedure, but how do I nevertheless understand the power dynamic there? So it's about introducing an understanding of social power dynamics as constitutive of the bureaucratic aspects of life, if that makes sense. So how long have I got, Christy? 10 seconds. Okay. Oh, 8 minutes, great, okay. Right, don't worry, I've got something, I've got something I'd like to read, and I'd like to get to that, so I just need to check myself. So I think what I originally thought I was grappling with when I started to write the book was this issue of loss, this issue of personal loss, and how that plays out within institutional context, and how that connects up to these larger narratives, what all this stuff means, how do we negotiate this stuff. So that was around the pressures of the homogenizations that we experience as workers or decision makers within institutional contexts. So the pressure to conform when we understand that aspects of what we do are highly problematic systemically as well as on a personal level. So for me, those negotiations are the crux of this thing that I talk about in terms of relational politics. So what my empirical work does, and I can't really talk about in any great detail, but the publisher would probably want me to say, go and buy the book or something. It was far too expensive. So, but is around this thing. So the empirical work looks at those everyday struggles that I'm talking about as actually creative spaces where institutional life actually occurs very differently than the categorical fantasies through which we understand it, often in academic terms. So these categories of race, gender, age, even I talk about neoliberalism in terms of a fantasy ideal that kind of guides our behaviours. So really what I'm interested in doing is trying to understand what we actually do in practice together institutionally, rather than what we are told we should be doing, we should be aspiring to, or what we're constructed as doing. So I'm interested in prizing apart the difference, I suppose, between our lived realities and the creativities and difficulties and painful aspects that can bring up within institutional contexts, but as a form of agentic social change. That actually, if we I'm trying to choose my words carefully. There's all sorts of words I could use about this. We're less scared about, took more risks with, or even recognised as powerful in our day-to-day activities, then actually institutional change might be nearer within our grasp than we imagine. So there is part of this argument, and I've kind of tried to bring it down much more to less the level of the sorts of theoretical languages I'm using, but part of this argument that's about the difference, the gap between what we do and what we imagine we do. Now, that's not to say that there is no material impact of problematic or helpful agencies within institutional contexts, but it is to say that the narratives around how we behave and who we are aren't the only things that have an impact on how the world turns out to be. Okay, so in a sense, it's a very hopeful book. Many people that read my work say it's pretty depressing. So because part of what I focus on as the crux of that kind of creative agency is actually the pain, the difficulties, the violence is very real, not only just symbolic, that we do to each other within institutional contexts and within the context of the state and politics. And I'm interested in confronting those as a means to not kind of wallow in them, but to understand how we work through them in everyday contexts. So pain, for me, is kind of a very real aspect of institutional life that we need to understand and confront in a very real sense within our relationships with one another, and also within kind of cross-institutional relationships, all of those things. So this issue of constitutive difference in relation to that becomes very important, because much of the pain, that sort of institutional pain that we're talking about in the English context, so I'll come on to that in a second, but is historically kind of constructed and enacted. It's actually pain that has temporal and spatial longue durée. So this isn't about stuff that we do to one another in the present. It's about histories of systemic violence, discrimination, how that positions us in relation to one another, and how we act with those things in the present. So much of the resistance to confronting pain within institutional space, violence within institutional space, anger, anxiety, all of those things is actually an attempt to repress our own relationship actually to that pain, let alone to recognise the reality of other people's kind of pain and difficulty. And that becomes important when I kind of think about the wider context of what I wanted to talk to you about. So very briefly, before I just read, and then I can probably draw it to a close there, hopefully, if Christy doesn't stop me reading quick. But it was just to be quite explicit about who the book was written for. So we always write our books for multiple different whos. And I suppose in a way my book was probably quite a selfish book in that I actually think it was written for me in terms of the sorts of work. You know, it was a book I wish somebody had written for me, right? Or they could give me. And of course, when you write a book, you realise that nobody can give you anything like that and you just have to work through it. But anyway, so it was about me. It was about understanding my own world. It was for my family, my friends, my colleagues. And I don't mean that in terms of that I really think that they should know this. It was actually, I suppose it was a bit of an act of love. I hadn't thought about it in this way. I don't know whether they'd see it quite like this, but about us trying to work through together what institutions, politics and the state kind of meant for us. And I'm very glad Christy kind of talked about enactments earlier, because I'm not even getting onto that. But I think there's something very important in relation to the English context that I was writing in at that time. Christy very helpfully, again, has mentioned Thatcher for me. So at the time that I started doing my empirical work and that I started writing the book, we were kind of experiencing in the English context the rise of the new left, and the new, I would probably call them the new left. So it was the political manifestation, the formal political manifestation of social movement politics, really. So the rise of feminism, the rise of anti-racism, so the rise of activist politics within the context of the state, right? And so in a sense, the people that I'm speaking to in the book, and me as somebody who was growing at that time, kind of maturing allegedly, it was a very optimistic time. It was a time where we were imagining that we could reconcile all sorts of things in a way that would bring social inclusion, financial prosperity. We were moving into a very new context away from those old historical kind of pains. And that was a very strong narrative. I think I am losing the mic a bit. That was a very strong narrative within the English context, kind of nationally, but also within the political context. So I was speaking against that very, very explicitly, because that wasn't something that I really recognised in my own life. The Spice Girls, I don't know, the Spice Girls, I know they definitely came over here and met Nelson Mandela at one point. So hopefully you're all aware, but very, very positive, kind of that sort of political feeling. And I was speaking very much against that. So I'm not allowed to read, Christy? Okay, really quickly. So those were the reasons. So all I wanted to do really was give you a sense of how that changed for me, because really I think, so it's coming from those small beginnings in a sense, that very personal kind of political engagements, the book became much bigger. And I think really what I would think of it now is as a kind of a way of thinking about the desire for power as the desire for a kind of worldly omnipotence, actually within us, but also within the institutional space and the kind of state space. Okay, I'm going to try very quickly. I'm sorry, I know I'm being naughty and taking a bit of time, but this is a really important concept for me, and this became central to the book, and I didn't really understand quite at the time how central it was. And it was this notion of neoliberal whiteness, because it really it brings together all of those different sorts of things that I've been talking about. Okay, so I'm just going to try and read and see how it goes. So following that line of argument, the one that I've just been presenting about certain social differences as being liberalism's constitutive outside, so liberal politics is constitutive outside, what actually makes it? It's possible to see a repressive melancholic dynamic as the means by which Western neoliberal democracies come to increasingly know the other. So the various others that we position. So if we think about white masculinity as being normative, we might position black masculinities, black femininities, white femininities as different sorts of others, okay? So imperial histories are left out of the liberal political story, which becomes the story of the state. In the English context, this means that the British and European colonial histories, so crucial to understanding the enactment of the British state, are split off from the contemporary presence of minoritised citizens in the UK. So the relationship between the British/English majority, who are idealised to be white in my context, and the racialised other is understood to be severed. So we're understood as occupying different spaces categorically, right? Within our imagination and also within our daily practices. So white knowledge is effectively split from the racialised social relations of its production. From within that sort of melancholic dynamic, racialization processes are Manichean and repressively split. So they're polarized where, and this comes from Anling Cheng, her brilliant work around this set of issues. So she says racialization operates through the institutional process of producing a dominant white standard national ideal, which is sustained by the exclusion yet retention of racialized others. The national topography or centrality and marginality legitimizes itself by retroactively positioning the racial other as always other and as lost to the heart of the nation. So this is the sorts of forms of repression, the interrelations which we're grappling with in institutional life consistently and which are almost completely erased or characterized in very particularly separated categorical ways within the English context. So, but this resistance then to knowing the racialized other, this fundamental ambivalence towards the other's subjectivity and therefore its humanity, is also a failure to know the white and neoliberal self. And I use that notion of whitening very explicitly because what I'm interested in is the ways in which whiteness is about a set of practices that are symbolic, that are affective, and that are material. You know, none of us starts off as being a particular racialized body, person. It takes a lot of ideological, symbolic, and practical work to sustain ourselves as beings that are socially constructed in particular ways. So that's what I'm interested in getting at there. I'm going really quickly and stopping, Christy. Do you want me to stop now? Okay. Okay, that's what I tried to do. Okay, so I think I'll try and just wrap it up here with this last little bit. So, but within modernity then, so I'm interested in making an argument about modernist politics, liberal politics, as that is enacted through our imaginings of the state and linking it up to these kind of daily practices. But within modernity, whiteness operates as the metaphor for the dominant liberal norm. It's the unknown, empty, standardizing ideal against which race can be seen. Whiteness is indescribable in its generality, its apparent everythingness, the dominant standard of humanity against which the race particular is measured. And so for me, what becomes important about that is it's this relationship of liberalism to neoliberalism that becomes fused through ideas of bureaucratic technical practices that we understand as political practices, which are actually infused with the sorts of historical repressions that I'm interested in kind of prizing apart, and that actually underpin our everyday engagements within institutional contexts. So you didn't get the really good bit about the ascendancy of that, but anyway, that's my favourite bit, but I'll stop. Thank you. So anyway, I hope that helps.
Thanks a lot, Shona. Hello, hello. Thanks for that. And as you can hear, this is really a fascinating work. It comes in at many different angles. And now we are going to move over to our, one could say, our panel of discussants who will be illuminating various parts that have stood out to them and also critically discussing the work. Firstly, I want to introduce Professor Desiree Lewis, who will be our first discussant. She is a professor in the Department of Women and Gender Studies at the University of the Western Cape. She's a council member of the National English Literary Museum and she's currently serving on the editorial boards of 4 academic journals. Her research interests span literary and popular culture, global feminist knowledges and politics, the politics of visuality and representation, post-colonial writing and culture, with a focus in developing feminist intellectual activist networks throughout Africa through research and editorial work on feminist networking and knowledge production. Publications include her book, Living on a Horizon, Bessie Head and the Politics of Imagining, various journal articles in Agenda, Social Dynamics, Feminist Africa, Feminism in Africa, and chapter contributions to various books, including Was It Something I Wore, Dress Identity Materiality, and the book that I think quite a few people know, edited by Sylvia Tamale, African Sexualities. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Desiree to talk to us for about 15 minutes about the book. Thanks.
I'm not sure why I've been discriminated against, but anyway, I'm more comfortable with this. So can everybody hear me? Yeah. Yeah, in the course of reading the book, I constantly found myself rethinking arguments and themes that I, and I think along with many other South African feminists, have been pondering over. So Shona's book is, for me, extraordinarily thought-provoking in allowing various readers to think through their own context-specific power dynamics related to neoliberalism, racial supremacy, and resistances, but through addressing very specific trends in the UK. So it's very focused on the English context, but it speaks to other contexts as well. And it obviously goes without saying that I find the book highly relevant to progressive South Africans, not only those who claim feminism, trying to make sense of power and struggles for democratic futures in the present day. I definitely can't do justice to everything that interested me, but I want to talk a bit around 3 themes and what they've prompted for me. First is Shona's argument about the state. It's surprising, to say the least, for a South African to read a defense of the potential for revolutionary transformation from within the state. And Shona's defense is made from a radical anti-neoliberal perspective that is definitely not aimed at redeeming the state's control by national and global elites. Among South African feminists and progressives generally, there's very little of this kind of confidence now, as we know. Following our relatively brief moment of confidence in the state and national machinery to deliver on gender transformation and broader democratization, progressives have become increasingly cynical about the state's token commitment to gender transformation through, for example, the Commission for Gender Equality. And of course, even the laws around gender transformation and the policies. Our sense in the past decade or so is that the state is hopelessly tainted. We need to look beyond the state to civil society for change. And any evidence of change is simply window dressing. Shona, by arguing that relational politics creates contradictions for more positive ways of thinking about the state, prompts us to rethink our cynicism. At first, I thought about whether this optimism takes into account post-colonial states, where national elites invest so much in the state apparatus for accumulating wealth and power. In other words, the kind of corruption, nepotism, the plundering, the wholesale plundering of the state that we know about at the present is very much symptomatic of the way in which the state is positioned in post-colonial contexts. It's very different from states, the way that states function in the global north. So this might be, we might want to take this up in the discussion later. But even if we do take the distinctiveness of corrupt post-colonial governance into account, Shona's arguments are still profoundly valuable. In the case of education, for example, it's clear that contestation, as we see today, emerges out of contradictions between state institutions, administrators, and citizens. Very rich site of resistance. And these tensions, as Shona argues, even though she's not writing about South Africa, are often manifested in and played out through feelings. For example, I was thinking about how current expressions of pain and loss among students, articulated by students, are central today to their protest. Even though material and practical issues, specifically university fees, might seem so pivotal. The sense of loss and pain is directly addressed in Shona's discussion of melancholia and loss. In other words, the book identifies the realm of passion that so often drives political struggles. And I mean, we know that passion is always part of political struggles, but I think what's often suggested in the book is that passion is central, probably the most important driving force behind political struggles. This leads me to a second theme I found especially valuable, which is the book's emphasis on passion in relation to politics. It seems to me that as South African scholars and scholar activists, we rely very heavily on quite instrumentalized views about links between class positioning, consciousness, and political behaviors, sort of an old historical materialist determinism that we still, I think, lean quite heavily on. So we often reductively explain political behavior with reference to individual social positioning and material interests, as though these material factors only are important in determining political responses and consciousness. And I think in contrast to this, there's a trend in South African social psychology to pay careful attention to psychological processes while neglecting insight into the complex material and social circumstances that determine this. So for me, the interdisciplinary value of power politics and the emotions is that it untangles the tricky connections between the psychosocial, the emotional, and the material. As the author puts it, and I think you might have quoted the same phrase, politics is enacted through a combination of material, social, and affective relations. It's this focus on connections between facets of human, social, and political experience that also makes the book so relevant to readers across disciplinary divides of cultural studies, psychology, politics, and sociology. I think of myself as interdisciplinary, but I was often amazed by the leaps made in this book. I was speaking to Heidi about this before. For example, an explanation of suicide will be linked to a detailed analysis of policy in a way that forces readers, and I think feminists generally are interdisciplinary, but as I say, it really kind of compelled me to pay attention and to think about connections that usually aren't made in scholarship. I think these are the kinds of connections, interesting, that are often made in fiction, in novel writing, in poetry, you know, where you kind of get an insight into power in this kind of way. Apart from this interdisciplinary appeal, the arguments about connecting the emotions to politics are highly relevant to understanding power and politics in South Africa today. I've already mentioned the student protest here, but it may also be the case that the most important driving force behind any opposition to oppressive systems is the passion stemming from a kind of denial of difference that you write about, a kind of dehumanization, a loss of self that affects both the oppressor and the oppressed. A third theme, and one it's of particular interest to me, and you've spoken about it, I think, Shona, at quite a bit of length, so let me try not to flog it, is the book's analysis of neoliberalism and especially neoliberal whiteness. To me, this is a seriously neglected subject in South Africa. Although, as we know, much scholarship and activist work has been done on racism and more recently decolonization, I often think that this isn't always connected to global neo-economic processes that, in a sense, normalize oppression. What I found especially insightful in the book is the way neoliberalism is diagnosed. And you said that people found your book kind of depressing. And I think it's because of that unrelenting unraveling of the layers of power, that diagnosis. As both an economic system, neoliberalism is diagnosed as an economic system, and a system that sets in place racialized subject positions. And I think very often, as I say, we don't pay enough attention to those connections between what makes sense economically and also how racialism is played out in terms of those kinds of market forces and those economic relationships. Furthermore, as the author argues, we are all responsible, and I found this a crucial argument. It's made in different ways at different times, and I'm quoting here. We are all responsible for the multiple intersecting exclusionary practices creating unequal social orderings. We are all responsible for the multiple yeah. So for me, what is interesting is the way that this leads us beyond the usual way of thinking about oppressive systems as one in which certain groups straightforwardly oppress others, and towards recognizing one which, in a Foucauldian sense, power is dispersed. And here Shona's attention to relational politics becomes extremely compelling because it provokes us to understand how our central systems of oppression revolve around the messy but also very promising nexus of cooptation and coercion, complicity and rebellion. Okay. So Shona reminds us how important it is to explore oppressive power not as something out there, but as something in here, something within us and within, deeply embedded in our institutions. For example, how powerfully neoliberalism has been internalized through promises of reward and acceptance, all those managerialist and auditing processes that we often so readily accept as common sense, as being in the interests of the common good. In the educational sector, for example. Neoliberalism permeates our world, to use the language of the book, in ways that create docile subjects and normative governing subjectivities. This attention to neoliberalism also alerts us to how racial supremacy actually works, not as something that is consciously adopted or dismantled, but as a much more insidious system. Like neoliberal efficiency, whiteness, and I'm quoting here, becomes civilizational and untouchable in its promotion of the general good. Invitations to come into the human race operate as invitations into neoliberal whiteness. And I think I'm going to round off now. This argument raises important challenges for us to rethink decolonization, something that's very key to discussions in South African context. Decolonization, in terms of the author's emphasis on relational politics, involves much more than simply getting rid of particular icons, epistemologies, or texts and replacing them with others. Reminding us of this, Shona writes, normative, and I'll end off with this quote because I find it so powerful, normative neoliberal whiteness is extended through its silent, benevolent outreach. We know this very well. Through the very power to reach out and to offer inclusion to its excluded others, women, older or queer subjects, for example, and thus through the power to make decisions about which groups come into its purview on the basis of which forms of inclusionary and exclusionary bargains. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Desiree. And that links very nicely into the whole phenomenon of homonormativity, which I'm hoping we'll be able to speak about a bit further later on. The selective inclusion of selected members of marginalized groupings. So moving on to our next discussant, who's Professor Grace Kuno. She's an associate professor at the sociology department at the University of Johannesburg, and she's vice dean of research in the Faculty of Humanities. Professor Kuno is an associate, well, no, I've just read that. Oh, well. Then Grace holds a PhD in sociology, master's also in sociology, and a BA honors in industrial sociology. And she has research interests in gender and health, social policy, and the black middle class. She writes creatively and academically, and has published in peer-reviewed journals, book chapters, and research reports. And her publications include, among others, her authored book, What Middle Class? The Flux Experiences of Class, and articles in journals such as Development Southern Africa, Open Family Studies Journal, International Journal of Psychology, the South African Review of Sociology, and so forth. She has presented more than 30 papers in international and local conferences and reviews articles for SARS and other local academic journals. SARS, I'm sure, means, yeah, not the revenue services. Yes. Grace, can I hand over to you? And you've got 15 minutes.
Thanks. I really enjoyed this book. When I met Shona earlier, I told her that I think she's crazy. Because I found that she is able to bring a number of issues that, you know, when you're writing from a sociological perspective, when you're writing on the state, you miss the connection. And I think the problem with how we have theorized is the separation of the disciplines. And I think the book begins to bring, you know, those important connections in ways that I have not seen before. For example, I liked how you speak to emotions and how you centralize emotions in how, I mean, you write from the perspective of the state, but my reading of the book in relation to how you center emotions in how we engage with institutions, I find that it speaks to how institutions work. For example, I could see myself in how you have written about emotions. I've seen myself in how I engage at UJ, in how you write about how emotions are significant in helping us see how we are positioned as the other, by the other, but also how we position ourselves. So emotions are very important, because without emotions, you don't know how you are positioned. And therefore, you are unable to reflect and therefore react or act. So when in feminist thought, when we talk about the personal is political, I mean, it's quite surprising that although emotions are implied in feminist writing, you know, I have never found any text that grapples with what these emotions are and what they do and how they help us see the personal as political. Because emotions, I mean, when you feel discrimination, when you deal with discrimination, when you feel disempowered, then you know that you are positioned in a particular way, a way that might not necessarily, a way that's historical. So as a Black woman, you know that I'm not dealing with this issue as a person now, I'm dealing with something historical, and therefore it becomes political. Because it's not only about you as a person, it's about, you know, the system and how, you know, you have been defined by, you have been positioned by neoliberalism, by whiteness. You are called in to act in particular ways, and when you don't, you are othered. Now you know, because of how you feel in the particular space. So I found that the book for me brings together some of those theories that we normally don't think they connect. And I think because it does that, it helps one think about how personal loss manifests in an institution. How when you feel disempowered, you might actually resign before you are ready, or you might actually not even apply for a post that you want, because you feel and you are dealing with personal loss of self. But again, I also found that even though you're writing from the British perspective, that the book is quite relevant for South Africa, and for South Africa currently. I mean, you talk about the fact that we now dealing with the concept of decolonialization, and I find that the decolonial theory basically talks about, there's a concept in decolonial theory that talks to decolonial love. And I think your theorizing begins to grapple with that idea, because basically it says that, you know, decolonial theory teaches that some of the things that we experience are very complex. And I think your book begins to grapple with what is it about, you know, coloniality that is complex. You know, you are saying that it's not only the buildings, it's not only, you know, it's also the personal, you know, and the personal makes it complex. So I mean, for example, I find that as a Black woman, when you stand up to represent Black people, you are also representing yourself. But then the challenge is that when you represent a group, you know, you are under pressure to represent the group, but then you are also dealing with your own individual fears, individual pains, and therefore you are never, not even only as a Black woman, but as a Black person, you are never a whole being, because the group thinks that you can do certain things, but in an institutional space, there are limitations in terms of what you could do. And also because neoliberalism presents itself in ways that a friend of mine likes saying that it traps because it provides the shiny stuff. So you also dealing with how do I access the shiny stuff? Because you live in a liberal environment, you have a bond to pay, you have school fees to pay. So you are caught in between. How do I represent this? But then how do I also survive in the space? So I think that how you address some of the issues around emotions, around pain, around loss, begins to grapple with how as individuals, how are we limited? But then also, you also begin to say, through understanding and through grappling with, through being with our emotions, we stand a better chance of actually providing change. But I think what I also found was that it's very difficult. I mean, what you are suggesting is very difficult because the way, I mean, if you're critiquing a culture that you grew up in, you critique it based on what it has taught you. So you really don't really have the tools to work outside of it. So there's a conflict between agency and structure all the time. So it is difficult. So do you confront your feelings? Do you confront your disempowerment and stay and change? Or do you confront for 2 minutes and then go home and lick your wounds? So what you are suggesting, I find is important because it begins to help us think about how emotions help us understand how institutions work, but also how we work within institutions. And it presents possibilities for change, but I find that it's very difficult. Another thing that I really thought was quite important in how you present your argument in the book is that the languages we use for trying to get change matter in relation to what they mean in the space, how different individuals will read that language, what it means for them, has implications for whether change will happen or not. So for example, you present a situation where two people think about diversity differently, and that impacts how they position themselves and also what is possible for them. So the language of change that we use is very important for whether change will happen or not. So I really thought that was interesting in thinking about whether change happens or it doesn't, and why. But also what is recognized as powerful. Sometimes sometimes in spaces we think that when we do things, they are not powerful because they have not been seen as the norm, and therefore we might hold back and or question whether our intentions will have an impact. But then how you position emotions and how the possibilities that we have in institutions to see where we are positioned and therefore act in particular ways, I think is really useful for suggesting that what you might think is powerful in a context that in a context that does not demand the normative is quite important, because what will change how we do things in institutions is not what has been done, is what we have not attempted. And it takes some courage to actually look at the possibilities and say, I'm going to do this, even though it might not necessarily look powerful or seem powerful at the moment, because that's what might actually lead to change. I also had a few questions for you. Now, when you started talking, you did mention why you wrote the book and who it is for, but I didn't see it when I was reading. I know that I didn't read everything, but I was wondering, how you, especially in chapter 4 and chapter 5, how you, because I think in chapter 2, when you engage with Bill, you are actually very clear that you are engaging with him as a white woman, and therefore, it becomes clear how you are positioned in relation to him. But then when you engage Annie and I think it's Yola, your positioning as a white woman doesn't come through. And you do a very detailed analysis and interpretation of what they share with you. And my question was, how are you able to, do that interpretation of what these women tell you, given that they are black women in Britain and you are a white woman, a professor? How do you do those interpretations, and how do you position yourself? I mean, in how you interpret what they say, and would that be how they interpret what they say? And I say this because I don't have access to the transcripts, and you provide very short transcripts, and you speak, I mean, you say a lot of important things from how you analyze, but I was wondering, how do you, account for your own positioning and their own differential positioning in how you do the interpretation? Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot. Thank you, Grace. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our next discussant, who's Dr. Heidi Grunebaum. She's a senior researcher at the Center for Humanities Research, also at the University of the Western Cape. Her work focuses on memory, narrative, and aesthetic responses to the afterlives of mass violence and psychogeographies of displacement. Her publications exploring this include a monograph memorializing the past, everyday life in South Africa after the TRC, a co-edited book, Uncontained, opening the Community Arts Project Archive, and a co-produced documentary film, which I've seen, which is really a brilliant piece of work, I have to add, called The Village Under the Forest. Dr. Grunebaum has also published extensively in current writing, research, in African literatures, Phantomas, the PMLA, Encounters, International Journal on Culture and Society, Third Text, Africa, and so forth. Her master's is in French literature from UCT, a PhD is in history from UWC, and she held an A.W. Mellon postdoctoral fellowship at the CHR before taking up the permanent post. So Heidi, I'm going to hand over to you. Thanks. Also 15 minutes.
Thank you.
Okay. Obviously.
Can you hear me? No. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yay. Thank you. And thank you very much to Leora and her colleagues for inviting me down up to Johannesburg for this panel. And thank you to my panelists and Christy and Shona for writing this book. I felt there's been a stuckness in the way that we're trying to think ourselves out of our current predicament in South Africa. And it almost felt like reading this book was, it opened up some pathways, and I'm deeply grateful to Shona, and I, off the record, offer to share my PDF. Don't tell your publisher and pretend I didn't say that. It should be read widely and engaged widely. Makes many significant, can you hear me? Is this better? Okay. It makes many significant theoretical interventions, and a number of the panelists have already kind of touched on them, too many for me to elaborate. So I just, and it's kind of scholarly heft is, it's impressive. Its ambition is massive. It's bold. It's certainly not a small book. But I want to also just pick up on, really on two openings that I read in a book and the directions that they invite me to think in. and slightly outside of the setting of institution and policy making of the neoliberal state. And these are ideas about the everyday and the question of relational politics that are really central to the book. And they offer an orientation in our collectively but differently experienced current moment in South Africa towards a different ethical horizon and space of possibility, one that, in the spirit of multiple, including post-colonial feminist and psychosocial feminist approaches the book takes, refuse binaries of thought, as well as a desire for a politics bereft of the complex loam in which contradiction, difference, multiplicity, and memory, and of course feelings, live. And I'm focusing on the everyday and relational politics for two, hopefully what will become clear, entangled reasons. And the first is that next week, 20 years ago on April 15, I think it was April 15, 1996 in East London, were the first Human Rights Violations Committee hearings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And commemorative anniversaries have a strange way when those events have been quite central as they were in my own life, because they put in a very circumscribed and problematic ways questions of emotion into the public sphere, definitely kind of pruned away the politics of that, but nonetheless put them there. You know, I kind of wanted to just revisit what was also my own very, very strong, quite either or critique of the process. And, you know, in your book, reading your book in light of this 20th year anniversary also had me thinking of other possible ways of engaging that process, other ways of reading that process that were more complex and more complicated, possibly. And the second is, you know, the second reason is that the everyday is a fascinating concept. And I mean, one of the ways I've thought about it is not necessarily in the hopeful, but as the time and space in which systemic violence, racialized exclusion, and disavowal have been normalized, or been made normal, made natural, the way things are. And Shona's book orients the concept towards a much more complex and, importantly, more hopeful. I found your book incredibly hopeful and incredibly positive, but also risky, which involves a willingness to inhabit and abide by the inhospitalities of life in a neoliberal state. And I think it's really important to think about what does a neoliberal state mean when it's also a post-colonial, post-apartheid settler state. I think, you know, these are important nuances and kind of layers that we could add to the conversation. The TRC, as an institutional technique of political change management, began its work, and this is a kind of coincidence perhaps, as the new democratic state was shifting away from the RDP, it's more so the more socially redistributive macroeconomic program of the RDP towards the more avowedly neoliberal strategy of the growth, employment, and redistribution strategy in 1996. The public nature of those first 2 years of hearings shaped the way that apartheid could and could not be spoken about publicly. And not coincidentally, emotions and politics, as I alluded to, profoundly shaped and were given shape by the affective, social, and mediatized economies that circulated through that process. And I just want to add that, you know, that since the early 90s, neoliberal prescriptions for state administrations in countries in transition to democracy, you know, often in the global south, but also in former Eastern Europe, have required the kind of cultivation of a temporal and spatial distance from the past. And you also pick that up in kind of the in comments you make about the kind of new labor and new managerialism and the ways in which this kind of the past is split off as a kind of another country, and as which has particularly violent effects. So historically embedded and socially reproduced mechanisms of structural violence, racialized exclusion, psychosocial affect, and material impacts of what remain and continue were excised, erased, or, according to your book, repressed. I mean, if I read your book, kind of to analyze that. There were proper responses, and pain was one proper response, sadness, remorse, forgiveness, and there were improper responses, and including what you call bad feelings, or what's her name? The author of Bad Feelings? Yeah, no, okay. Such as anger, ambivalence, and the rightful public refusal to forgive, refusal to reconcile, and those were bad feelings. Those weren't proper. So to a large degree, apartheid through the prism of the discursive economies of the TRC was split off from more complex durational notions of time and experience. And this, I believe, ended up repressing the effects of the lived effects of apartheid as a system that was legally defeated, but not yet or only partially worked through and worked on. Temporal splitting and amnesiac, morally sanitizing narratives that could be called reconciliation histories may also have contributed towards producing the discursive conditions that seem to promote binary thinking, that seem to almost predict cycles of repetition, the kind of Hobbesian logic and plots that we know what the end will be, what the outcome will be. And that's the kind of thinking that Shona's book is worried about and is theorizing against, and trying to move out of, that dead end, which is a kind of a story of apocalypse that everyone knows how it will end, but not necessarily what will begin anew from there. So the book alerts us to the need to think time much more carefully so as to inhabit and abide by the contradictions and predicaments of our time in life-affirming, this is what I took from it, life-affirming, relational, and creatively oxygenating ways. It offers a way to think about resistance, interruption, alliances, and social change via a very tense twinning of what she calls emotional multiplicity, the messiness of emotions, and cognitive simplification, the ways in which cognitive processes tend to reduce, search for the categorical and the simple. And that this is also a space which, between the ethical and the political that is situated in the everyday. So Shona's book, in it, I read the everyday as visibilizing the shifting aliveness of the social matrix for relational politics that enable ethical moments, but within institutions, but also, as I'm suggesting, outside. And then I go into a whole spiel about the everyday as how there's a generic kind of concept of the everyday, but that systemically the everyday is differentiated, and the kind of social categories that we use to think inequality and power play out profoundly in the everyday. But not only, and I think what's important is the not only, it's the not either or, it's the and also. Because if the entangled temporalities of the everyday position and shift subjects in multiple overlapping affective relations, enabling different modes of agency, connection, and movement, the kinds of dynamic encounters that characterize relational politics become open, in her argument, to allowing us to perceive moments of change, of contingency, of accident, of spontaneity, surprise, and even connivance, connections with those that somehow are those moments of connections or connivance may be mitigated against. And yet in that kind of openness, that rupture of the everyday, there is a connivance. And that possibility, I think, is very interesting to think, no matter how transient it is. And particularly in terms of your microanalyses of relational politics to, as a way to think the creative possibilities for subversion, and of course resistance. So the extent to which relational politics remain invisible to the social imagination, and Shona argues they're actually right there, they're very close, yet actually lived out, the greater the struggle, and this is what I'm taking your book to, a proposition it's making, the greater the struggle for reinvigorating collectively imaginable alternatives for more egalitarian and democratic social relations, despite state form. And so too greater the challenge becomes to recognize and support already existing and emergent modes of relational politics, which in their very form undo binary thinking, refuse totalizing narratives, and help us avoid, or help me avoid yielding, let me own my desire for a morally and politically uncontaminated state outside the state, whilst being attuned to the duration of memory in its lived and material traces in the here and now, particularly of structural violence and oppression, and of entitlement and privilege. In this understanding, the everyday presents the social imagination and the creative imagination, because imagining, conjuring what hasn't yet been tried or hasn't yet been done is a profound act of creative imagination, with a number of challenges related to mourning lost futures, as well as envisioning alternative ones that may be thinkable and perceivable under our very noses, as it were, and to which, as I read this remarkable book, we are all in different ways accountable. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Heidi. I think that let's jump straight in, because people have now had quite a bit of time to listen to our voices. So I'd love to hear from our audience. And let's jump straight into our Q&A session. So who wants to have a first bite? I think while people are warming up, just in terms of what Heidi was saying now, something that I made a particular note about, as I mentioned earlier, was around there's a chapter on diversity, and as we know,